My name is Andy Fisher. I'm the Executive Director of EcoFarm, and it is my distinct honor to welcome you to the 42nd Annual EcoFarm Conference, Rooted in Resilience. It's been a long and winding journey to get here, and we sure wish we would have been in person with you at Asilomar, but unfortunately situations didn't allow us to do so. But we trust that we'll be able to do so in next year and beyond. So thank you for sticking with us in virtual conference land. And I have a few thanks to make. First, to our staff for pulling this together on a dime. It's been such a short time to transition this to a virtual conference, and it's been a superhuman feat to do so. So I just want to extend my appreciation to all the staff for turning us around so quickly. And then I also want to thank our sponsors who have continued with us, especially Sacramento Natural Foods Co-op, Full Belly, Farmer and the Cook, Driscoll's, Veritable Vegetable, CCOF, Stubbsky Foundation, and Heart and Soil magazine. And it's also my pleasure to introduce our first speaker. We're going to have a welcome from Jenny Lester Moffat, who is the Undersecretary for Marketing and Regulatory Programs at USDA, and she's the first woman to serve in this position. At USDA, she provides leadership for the Agriculture Marketing Service and for APHIS, working to build a more reliable, resilient, and equitable food system by strengthening ag markets and ensuring the health and care of animals and plants. Prior to joining USDA, Undersecretary Moffat worked at the California Department of Food and Ag, where she championed the critically important work of farmers and producers in her role as Undersecretary and Deputy Secretary. She's no stranger to EcoFarm. Her family has won a SUSTI award. She's a fifth-generation Californian, and she grew up on her family's organic walnut farm and processing operation. So we'd love to hear from you, Undersecretary Moffat, to take it away. Thank you.
Thank you, Andy. And yeah, it's a pleasure to be here today virtually with all of you guys. As you mentioned, Andy, it's, it's always wonderful to be at Asilomar, but really a pleasure to be with you guys here today. Yeah, as Andy mentioned, someone who grew up in the organic community, I think at age 9, I was starting to help or 12, I was helping my dad find organic markets for our walnuts then. So it's really a pleasure for me to be here with all of you guys today in my current capacity. So I'm excited to share with you some of the updates that the United States Department of Agriculture and the Biden-Harris administration are doing to focus on organic producers, organic market development, as well as our work in food system transformation. As Andy mentioned, more and better markets, more equitable markets are big priorities that we have here in the Biden-Harris administration. So for organic and the work that we're doing in organic, we have 3 key priorities. First is really building organic partnerships and protecting the organic seal. Next is advocating for organic as climate smart agriculture. And then finally, providing technical assistance and resources for transitioning farmers. So I'll first start just about protecting the organic seal and building partnerships. We've really been focusing on listening to the organic community, understanding the growing pains and the public-private partnerships that we've experienced, as well as identifying ways in which USDA can meet the needs of the growing American organic sector. So this means listening to stakeholders and asking for continuous improvement of organic standards. So we're working in partnership with the National Organic Standards Board. I hope we have some NOSB members here on the call today, the meeting today, as well as the organic community to move different organic standards forward. This has been a very big priority of Secretary Vilsack since he first started last spring. And the National Organic Standards, the National Organic Program in Agricultural Marketing Services sets and protects organic standards, as hopefully many of you guys know. It works to ensure a fair marketplace for organic standards and helps organic farmers so that they can earn organic premiums and their product in the marketplace. So organic is a really big part of local and regional food systems. It's also a growing sector in national and international supply chains as well. Demand for organic products have grown in the United States and around the world. sales of organic products in the United States have reached a record high of $62 billion in 2020. $62 billion. That's incredible. And we've heard really clearly that there are a number of organic rules that are very important to many of you to continue to build and protect that organic market. So in the past year, we've quickly worked in the National Organic Program and our staff and a partnership with you guys and hearing feedback as well on 3 top rule-making priorities. The first is origin of livestock. So this is a rule that that the organic community has been wanting for quite a long time. And I'm very excited. We're really close to delivering this. This is really about requiring organic milk products come from animals that have been organically managed. So this rule has already passed through the USDA and is now over at the Office of Management and Budget. And we hope to publish that rule. It's a final rule very soon. The second rule that we've heard a lot about and we're working quickly on as well is the organic livestock and poultry standards. This used to be called the OLPP, the Organic Livestock and Poultry Practices. It's a slightly different name. It was proposed back in 2016 and withdrawn in 2017. So in response, when Secretary Vilsack came back into office, he reversed that, and AMS has been drafting a new proposed rule based on that final rule. So this is about greater consistency in organic livestock practices to better satisfy consumer expectations that organic livestock meet a uniform and verifiable animal welfare standard. So this also has passed through our department and is now at the Office of Management and Budget. And again, we hope to publish that that rule for public. It's a proposed rule for public comment this spring as well. And then the third one is strengthening organic standards. This is about strengthening organic control systems to improve farm and market traceability in the organic supply chain, making sure that everyone in the organic supply chain is following the same rules for throughout the supply chain, creating better trust in the organic label and new organic enforcement procedures that match the increased complexity of the global supply chain. So the goal there is to publish that rule later in the summer of 2022. So later in the summer of this year. Those are the 3 big rules that we've been working on in the past year in this administration. The National Organic Program has been working vigorously on those 3 rules, but we also want to make sure, and as I said at the beginning, we really want to hear from the organic community what next. So we're working on these 3 rules. Now we have this moment where we have a lot of other rules that the National Organic Standards Board has had vigorous conversation throughout the past 10 or so years. Brought these different, a whole handful of important rules to us at the National Organic Program and USDA. And we want to hear from you guys about which ones we should take up next, which ones are most important. So we do have a public comment period that's open right now. We'll have a listening session next Monday. The public comment period is open to the end of this month, so the end of March. And we want to hear from you guys. And if you're not aware of this, certainly I also encourage you guys to sign up for the National Organic Program's Organic Insider newsletter as well. It's where we push out lots of information about what we're doing at USDA on organics. Certainly standards are very important. As someone who, again, grew up in the organic sector, I know how important standards, enforcement of those standards, and everything along the way is really important for making sure that we all have a robust organic sector, and we're all playing by the same rules and we're all operating by the same rules, really. But we also know that those developing and enforcing standards go hand in hand with things like market development and market protection. So that includes things like also in the work that we're doing across the department on climate smart agriculture and forestry practices. A few months ago, Secretary Vilsack announced a new climate smart agriculture partnership program. We're in the process of receiving applications now, but we also know that organic has been really at the forefront of climate standards and climate practices since its inception, for quite a while now. So as we're looking at a climate smart, more resilient, more equitable food and agriculture system, part of our job is ensuring that organic is at the table at USDA and in those conversations. I know climate change threatens our food security, our safety, our environment, and American farmers are on the front line. USDA is taking action not only to make sure that we're protected and we're doing things to be much more vigilant about climate change, but also to reverse climate change, to capture carbon, to do practices like the many things that we see in our organic system plans about soil building practices and other practices that are very climate positive practices. So we're working across the department, making sure organic is at the table, making sure organic is part of the conversation. And the National Organic Standards Board has also been an active voice in the discussion about organics and climate smart agriculture as well. Had a discussion at their fall meeting. I know they're going to have another discussion in April at the spring meeting about climate smart agriculture and organic, and also sent a really thoughtful letter to Secretary Vilsack on organic and climate change as well. So we've been asking them to continue that work, and we really look forward to the conversation that happens in April at the National Organic Standards Board meeting, as well as ongoing conversation as well. Last summer, Secretary Vilsack announced $200 million to support organic transition. This is something that is very exciting to me. I know we've had a lot of people really interested in this. This is again part of our effort to build more and better and fairer markets for American farmers. And this is about helping and supporting farmers as they're navigating the transition process or in the process already of transition and in organic. So this is about supporting robust markets after transition as well. So not just bringing new farmers into organic, but also supporting those markets as well. We're still working on the development of that program, and I'm excited at some point for sharing those specifics soon. But we've been meeting with a lot of people, listening to what is needed. And we're hearing a lot of incredible ideas, things like for transition support, direct farmer transition support, direct technical assistance on farm, field days, workshops on how to develop an organic system plan. And especially we're hearing a lot about farmer to farmer mentoring. We have incredible expertise in organic farmers, and the opportunity to tap those farmers and to be able to have those farmers, organic farmers, be mentors to new transitioning farmers is really very important. And this is, again, really about equity. And a lot of the work that we're doing at USDA is about equity, increasing access across the board to our programs that farmers who have traditionally been underserved, who haven't had the same access to our programs, is very important to us. So we can make these things available. We can put flyers out there. We can say, hey, yeah, come to us. But at some point, we are realizing that we need to come to producers. And so things like farmer to farmer mentorship is really about stacking and partnering the right mentors, the right people together, trusted local farmers, to be able to support farmers who are looking to transition. So this is really about equity and making sure that every producer who wants to become certified organic has the ability to do that. We're also, of course, working across USDA to make sure that we're addressing the myriad of challenges and opportunities that farmers make. So this means everything from all of our grant programs, our loan programs, conservation support, research, market development, data collection, and so much more. That organic is front and center and part of all of that work as well. So there are many hands across USDA that are supporting organic, from cost share to crop insurance to conservation assistance. We're really working on more communication and more robust communication in our cross USDA organic services to make it easier for farmers to access the resources they need at the right place and the right time. We really are focused on increasing and investing in growing the next generation of diverse organic expertise as well. The farmers, organic specialists, organic inspectors are working to develop and protect market for years to come. And so one example of this is we've partnered with Tuskegee University, a historically Black college and university. They're working with small scale organic farmers in Alabama to help them access more markets. One way to do this is by providing training in their own on-campus certified organic farm. This program is helping small scale organic farmers build a new infrastructure on their farms, meet growing organic demands, as well as increase their own bottom lines. So the Agricultural Marketing Services has provided funding for Tuskegee as well as other organizations across the country to build the next generation of qualified organic professionals. Certainly, organic represents a great market opportunity for many farmers. We've also really been focused on generally local and regional supply chains as well. So just 2 weeks ago, we announced an increase of $130 million from the American Rescue Plan that was adopted last spring. So $130 million over 2 years for the local agricultural marketing program. If you haven't heard of the local agricultural marketing program, it is, we call it LAMP for short. It is a new program that came out of the 2018 Farm Bill. And it funds things like farmers market promotion program, regional food system partnership programs, grant dollars to local organizations that work hand in hand with producers to access new markets, local and regional markets. So it's a really exciting program for us. We decided to give additional boost from what the Farm Bill funds had because of how important and how impactful the program has been in the few years that we have funded it. So we've added 130 million. So, and that'll be over the course of 2 years. So 65 million this year, 65 million next year. That with the Farm Bill funding, we have now a request for proposals out there. So our application period is now open and we're seeking applications, and we have $97 million total this year for funding. So that's one thing. We're also working on meat and poultry supply chains as well, increasing access and processing capacity, small, local, regional processing capacity across the country too, for meat and poultry processing. So we just announced a meat and poultry expansion program. There's $150 million in there through the form of grants for people to apply for. That's phase one. We have another phase that's going to come out later this summer of additional funding for the grant program, because we know some projects are ready to go now. Some will be ready to go this summer. We will also be doing and announcing some technical assistance as well. Very complex projects and application process. And we want to make sure, again, focusing on equity, that everyone has access to the program. So the technical assistance will hopefully make sure that we provide robust assistance, application assistance, or even pre-application assistance, so that people who are interested in starting new meat and poultry processing in different regions around the country will have that access and be able to apply for the program and be competitive in that application. So again, $150 million in this round, and then we'll have another round as well. And then also 2 weeks ago, we announced additional funding for the Dairy Business Innovation Centers. There are 4 centers around the country, one in the Northeast, one in the northern Midwest, one in the Southeast, and one in the Western, California, Oregon, and Washington. Those 4 centers have the ability to receive another $20 million this year. And this is really about providing new value add products, again, for local and regional markets, but also maybe export markets for dairy products as well. So a lot of really incredible things that are happening here at USDA. I'm excited that as we do every one of these things, we're making sure that we're listening to the people we're serving. That is the most important thing for me, is that we're here and I'm here to serve American agriculture. And so I'm constantly looking for your guys' thoughts and ideas on how we can best serve American agriculture and feed people really great, healthy, wholesome food that is locally, regionally produced. And so, certainly a pleasure for me to be here with you guys today to share a little bit about the work, and also invite you to come and talk with us. We do want to hear from you. So thank you. And I'm grateful every day for the work that you're doing, growing food, fiber, flora for all of us here in the country. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Undersecretary. We really appreciate having you here and hearing about all the incredible work you and your colleagues are doing at USDA. It's an honor and it's a pleasure to hear about all that. I want to move to our next speaker. His name is Greg Castro. He's going to provide a welcome to the homeland. And Greg's been a frequent speaker at EcoFarm and a longtime friend of the organization. So Greg, please, we'd love to have you come on.
Thank you. Shamasakish, Mishistu, Hersatuhi, greetings to you in the languages of my ancestors. I'm Greg Castro, Totralslinen, Rumson, and Ramatushaloni. And for many decades, EcoFarm has had their annual homecoming along the shores of my Rumson Ohlone lands in the place that's now called Asilomar. Our stories tell us that we were placed there by Creator at the dawn of the world to be the stewards of that place. The first people, being of great power and integrity, took this gift from the Creator and formed it into the world that existed up until recently. And we, the two-footers, the humans that followed the first people into the world, learned from them the knowledge and skills necessary to continue their sacred obligation and commitment to steward the world, which we have faithfully carried out for thousands of years and hundreds of generations. And we are still here. We're still at work to rekindle the spark of those sacred obligations of taking care of our home that have given us so much for so long, including very life itself. The last 250 years of our history, although quite short compared to the many thousands of years of our archaeological evidence and the cultural history that we have in this place, has been most challenging and devastating to our people. And yet we are still here. Our heritage, our ancestors, our deep spiritual beliefs that tie us to these birthplaces of ours, these lands that gave us life, are bonds that cannot be broken. In spite of the calamity, crisis, chaos, and near fatal cataclysm that befell our ancestors, we are still here. Our unbreakable bond with the land we walk on assures us that we will continue to be here, a resilient people, long after the present burdens have passed and the current oppressive social structure has faded away. We will still be here. I've been deeply honored and blessed to be gifted with profound and ancient knowledge by many elders and culture bearers who were generously sharing their learnings with me as they learned from their ancestors. And the story of our Rumson people is also true for most of the indigenous peoples, communities, and tribal entities that I've encountered here in California. We are all still here in our places that Creator intended us to place and to still do the work of our ancestors and for our descendants, taking care of the land, taking care of each other. That is the most sacred responsibility, we believe, and we believe that it is all of yours as well. I ask that you reflect in your hearts that is that not the core of what you do in what we call nowadays farming, tending the land, tending each other. For indigenous people, the word farming is such a simple word for such a deeply profound and sacred obligation, one that we believe is attached to all of our hearts, whether we know it or not. For we are all indigenous to some place of long ago in some way, even if we don't recall it in our minds. But the heart always remembers. And such farming takes many forms and degrees and may not involve always dirt as we now know it, but could involve the cultivating of relationships and with living things, all living things. And for Native people, we believe all things are imbued with life, and that these are necessary ties that we have regardless of whether we are aware of them or not. They still need cultivating. They still need tending. They still need nurturing. Those ties are vital to the resilience that we are all striving for, because we cannot stand alone in our work. As we rededicate ourselves to the sacred commitment in this churning, chaotic world, I hope you remember the most fundamental of the original instructions of the ancestors that they have passed on to us. The we in we are still here applies to all of us and binds us as humans to each other, the land that gives us life, and to the future we are trying to salvage. In this, I suggest you bond in some way with the indigenous people of the place that you are at now. And they are most certainly there, whether you are aware of them or not. And then join them in this work. It is a task they've been struggling for the last 250 years here in California, and much longer in other places of the world. And they have so much they can share with you in healing the wounds of our world and creating resilient communities for all of us together. Thank you for having me here. I hope you enjoy the day and share, in the words of my friend Elizabeth Hoover, in the teachings she will be sharing with us and her wisdom and knowledge that she will be gifting us today. Hait Spanikan. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Greg, for that wonderful introduction. I'm just going to share my screen here. So good morning. I am Elizabeth Hoover. I'm an associate professor in the Environmental Science Policy Management Department at UC Berkeley. And today I'm going to be talking about a project I've been working on for a number of years called From Garden Warriors to Good Seeds, the Native American Fight for Food and Seed Sovereignty. So just to get us kicked off thinking about what is food sovereignty, the organization La Via Campesina is probably best known for their definition of food sovereignty. And one of the definitions was developed in 2007 during a gathering in Mali, in which people from all over the world came together to discuss their land-based practices. And they defined it as the right of peoples to healthy and culturally appropriate food produced through ecologically sound and sustainable methods, and the right to define their own food and agriculture systems. Now, this is a little bit different from food security, and you've probably heard of a lot of different food security projects and programs, which are really geared toward helping people to consistently get enough calories. The food justice movement adds another layer to that and insists that people have equal access to safe and healthy food, that there are assurances that workers within the food system are treated fairly, and also accounting for the value of food in relation to the self-determination of communities. And food sovereignty kind of goes another layer even beyond that and says, okay, we don't just want equality within the current system, but we want our own food system. So I heard Winona LaDuke give a talk one time, and she said, we don't want just an equal piece of the pie, we want our own pie. So thinking about how communities cannot just be fighting for equal footing within the current food system, which has a lot of challenges, but how can communities be better deciding for themselves how they're procuring food, producing food, trading for food. And then within the broader food sovereignty movement, Indigenous communities really insist on recognizing the social, cultural, and economic relationships that underlie community food sharing that need to be nurtured. And this came up in Greg's talk just a minute ago, but thinking about how do you nurture relationships between people and each other, between people and the other than human communities that we rely on for food, and between people and the land. And thinking about those sacred responsibilities to nurture the relationships to land-based food and political systems. So this is kind of the whirlwind history of settler colonialism in North America. Why is it that Native communities here are currently fighting for food sovereignty? Well, there have been a lot of challenges to Indigenous food and seed systems over the last 500 years. Starting with scorched earth battle tactics, especially, I come from the Northeast where the French in the 1600s came through and as a way of trying to politically weaken the Haudenosaunee or Iroquois Confederacy, set fire to cornfields, destroyed food stocks, something that General George Washington then followed on in the late 1700s when he sent General Sullivan out with the instructions to lay waste to their settlements. So destroy as many stores of corn and other foods and fields and acres and acres. Millions of bushels of corn were destroyed as part of Sullivan's campaign, again, as a way of politically weakening Indigenous communities. And then you had the intentional destruction of buffalo herds across the plains for the Navajo Nation in the mid-19th century, when people were relocated to a prison camp called Bosque Redondo, families that did not quickly relocate as they were instructed. Kit Carson and his men burned orchards and fields and sheep herds as a way, again, of weakening people by destroying food. There was then the subsequent theft of land and relocations. So probably most famous, the Trail of Tears, Cherokee, Chickasaw, Choctaw, Seminole Creek, people relocated from the southeastern part of the country on a forced march to Oklahoma, over which thousands of people died. And when people got to these new lands they had been relocated to, they then had to relearn the plants there, the growing seasons, the soil is different. So really impacted people's ability to be able to feed themselves. And then already shrunken land bases were further made smaller through the allotment period. So the Dawes Act in 1887 took communally held land bases and divided them up into individual parcels that went to families, and many of which were then lost to land speculators. From the 1870s on through the 1950s, there were boarding schools in which Native youth were forcibly taken from their families and sent to boarding schools. There were other kind of indentured servitude programs on the East Coast as well as California even prior to that. But when youth were brought to these schools, they were taught that their food was wrong, that their ways of producing food were wrong, their religion was wrong, their language was wrong. So as part of this, people really took up different food systems and developed a different relationship with food. The Bureau of Indian Affairs really promoted Western farming methods and seeds, even among communities where people had already been farming for thousands of years. And that interrupted traditional food systems. There was the co-optation and commodification of native seeds by non-native collectors, seed breeders, and different companies from the 19th and 20th century. And then currently now people are contending with a changing climate that impacts people's abilities to farm and save heirloom seeds, concerns about cross-contamination with GMO seeds, especially corn, because the pollen travels so easily. In some communities, really a challenge of lacking access to land and tools and seed. So what are the impacts of having your food system really rapidly altered? Prior to 1940, there were very few cases of type 2 diabetes, and now it's the 7th leading cause of death for Native people. Native people die of diabetes-related illness at 249% greater rates than for other Americans. And hemorrhaging economies. So the White Earth Land Recovery Project did a survey a few years back in which they asked people, where they spend their food dollars, and found that the community spends $8 million a year on food, 7 million of which is spent off reservation. And so the concern was, okay, how do we help keep some of those food dollars to go toward local food producers? How do we help to support people in the community developing, growing, producing food rather than all of the money just heading out? So that's the grim portion of today's presentation. I think it's important just to kind of give you some background about why this issue is important and why people are fighting for it. But just to always keep in mind that there are always people fighting to make these situations better. So I started thinking about these issues of food sovereignty when I was living in Akwesasne, which is a Mohawk community on the New York-Canadian border. And I was volunteering with a group called Ganahio Yungoya Dohage, or We Are Planting Good Seeds, which has been working to try to help people get back into farming and gardening and seed saving and getting more youth involved and excited. So we would be sitting around at night after a hard day in the garden or taking care of chickens and wondering, how are other communities doing this work? How are people getting funding? How are they getting youth involved? How are they getting more community members involved? And so as part of that, I headed out on this adventure to find out. So I started going to different food sovereignty summits over the years and went to many different summits and met people who were doing these other native community-based farming and gardening projects. And then I went out on a road trip. So I drove 20,000 miles over 4 months in the summer of 2014 and visited 39 different communities and interviewed people about how are they defining food sovereignty? How are they promoting and supporting these kinds of projects? And so some of them were formal interviews that I recorded, others were farm tours and visits across different gardens. And then as part of that, because I was focusing specifically on farming and gardening projects, there really became an emphasis on heirloom seeds and native seeds. So I interviewed 30 different native seed keepers about that work. And then thinking about, okay, so you can grow all these heirloom seeds, you can get these gardens going, but how do you get people excited about eating it? So I started interviewing native chefs that I met at different food sovereignty summits and dinners. And then as part of this work, thinking about how the anti-pipeline, anti-extractive industry movement has also dovetailed with the food sovereignty movement, because you can't have access to safe, healthy food if you have a leaking pipeline going through your territory. So I also interviewed people who were part of that movement. And some of the questions that I was asking these native farmers were about, how these different community-based organizations got started, what were some of the successes and challenges, how they define food sovereignty, how do you decide what qualifies as an heirloom seed or a heritage seed or an indigenous seed, and where do people get funding from? Again, I was talking to different community-based projects, so a lot of them were nonprofits or tribal programs. How do you fund this kind of work? And what recommendations do you have for other communities trying to start projects like these? So I'm going to talk about some of those responses today. I started this blog called From Garden Warriors to Good Seeds, Indigenizing the Local Food Movement. If we have any academics in the crowd, you know that the publishing process is glacially slow. And the people that I was talking to wanted to know what each other were up to. They wanted to kind of hear some of these results sooner rather than later. So the blog was a way of having people to see what each other was working on. So the first chapter, and there's also an article that I'm happy to send people if you shoot me an email. It's called "You Can't Say You're Sovereign If You Can't Feed Yourself: Defining and Enacting Food Sovereignty in Native American Community Gardening." And so when I ask people, again, people like the term food sovereignty. Activists and academics really like these big terms, but I was curious to know, for people who are doing this work on the ground, how were they defining these kind of terms? And people's answers really focused on the restoration of physical, cultural, and spiritual health. So as you saw in the grim portion of today's presentation, the health statistics in Native communities could use some improvement. And so people were really focused on how do you grow healthy food to improve those health statistics, but also growing the kind of food that nurtures spiritual and cultural health as well, connecting cultural and language programs to these gardens. And growing specifically culturally appropriate foods, knowing that you're not able to just get some of these varieties in the store if you don't grow them yourself. Really focusing on nurturing the relationships between people and each other, people in the land and people in the food, and thinking about individual, community, and tribal self-sufficiency and control. So thinking about, to what extent do individuals have agency over what people are eating and where you're getting your food from? How do you ensure that the whole community has access to enough food? And what can tribal governments be doing to support Native food sovereignty within their own communities? A focus on economic independence. So how does the community become more self-reliant through supporting more local food producers? Making sure that people have access to this food, whether that's because they financially are able to, or able to barter or trade for it if they don't have money, or is there just enough of this traditional food in the community for people to access? And really thinking about food sovereignty as a movement, as a process, and a method, and not a final destination that, ta-da, we have achieved food sovereignty, all the food's coming from here, but rather recognizing it as a goal to work towards. And again, because I was focusing on community-based farming and gardening projects, there was really a continuing and revitalizing use of heirloom seeds focus. And so thinking about how these seeds in particular were such an important part of the movement. And I just love taking photos of seeds because I think they're so beautiful. And so part of talking to people about, how do you decide what qualifies as a heritage seed or an heirloom seed? And some people say, well, it's decided as a community. I don't decide it myself. These are seeds that we're all growing together and we've deemed as really important to our food, our ceremonies, our projects. Many of these are passed down through families. Some come from seed banks. Some have been, I'll talk about some seed rematriation movements that have come in from other places. So there were differing opinions about, does a seed have to have had a continuous place in the community uninterrupted? Some people were like, well, have the songs and ceremonies been put on these seeds? And if they've been grown out by these other people, they probably haven't been given the same treatment. As to other people said, well, even if we have to bring home seeds that have been away for a long time, the genes within those seeds connect us to ancestors. And so this handful of corn that Glenda is holding here connects you, all the decisions that all those different grandmas made at the end of each growing season to decide which seeds went into the soup pot and which ones get saved for next year. Every time you're planting out those seeds, you're connecting with all of those decisions made by generations of previous seed keepers. So the memory contained within those seeds and the cultural context of those seeds. So again, some of these foods won't be available unless you have these particular seeds. And the idea that they shouldn't be static. So thinking about how do you grow out an heirloom seed that's been passed down for many generations, but then still take the freedom to select at the end of the season the ones that appeal to you most, that taste the best, that grow the best in your area. And if you get down to just a few remaining seeds, being comfortable trading with a neighbor community to get some of their similar corn or beans and be able to introduce some of those genes as well to keep the population robust. So why is it important to plant and save heritage seeds? People said, well, it establishes this cultural connection to planting that you don't necessarily have when you're just planting cucumbers or tomatoes out of a catalog. There's a ceremonial context. So again, these foods are needed for ceremony, and there are ceremonies that are associated specifically with planting and seed saving that people aren't going to remember if you're not continuing to plant these seeds. And a focus on connecting seeds in the land. So this corn right here is a Dakota corn that was reintroduced to Dakota territory through the Dream of Wild Health Project. And they really felt like it was important to plant these Dakota seeds here on this land as a way of bringing those seeds home, and so that the land and the seeds would have each other again. And as part of this project, some of the Eldor mentors there described an importance of reestablishing connections to the ancestors for some of these youth. So the Dream of Wild Health Project works with urban Native youth in the Twin Cities, Minneapolis, St. Paul, and helps to bring them up and teach them how to grow food and harvest and cook the food and take it home to their families. So many of these varieties were seen as more nutritious than conventional varieties, and people were interested in feeling a sense of independence from industrial agriculture. So not just relying on seed catalogs or ag stores for your seeds, but being able to save for yourself from one year to the next and trade with your neighbors and your family. And some of these seeds have been in families for as long as anybody can remember. So I went out to visit Coche de Pueblo, and Jason, I asked Jason, so how long have you guys been planting these same corns? And he was like, forever, right? These seeds have always been here. And, they didn't mind if the, white corn got planted a little close to the blue corn, because he was like, well, my grandma really likes when these neat colors pop up. And so these corns, he said, it's important for him as a Pueblo man to plant these corns because, his grandmas and his aunties need this for graduations and ceremonies, and any kind of special occasion requires this corn, and there's no place else you can get it. And some seeds have kind of gone off on adventures and then come back. So there's been, this is Rowan White in the red shawl, who was the chair of the board for the Seed Savers Exchange. And when she took on that job, she said, okay, we have this huge seed bank here. We have all these different kinds of seeds that are publicly available, and many of them are labeled as having come from Indigenous communities. To what extent do those people in those communities still have access to all of these seeds? So they started growing out some of the seeds in the collection, including this squash that was from Taos Pueblo. And we were there a few years ago for a food sovereignty summit, and they brought, Rowan brought this squash with her and brought some seeds from it. And it was welcomed home like a lost child. You can see these women here, Henrietta Gomez in the yellow shawl, really cradling this squash, and it was, welcomed home like a baby, and people got teary over welcoming home this squash. So some seeds have never left, and some have left and gone on adventures and are being brought home. So the broader definition of seed sovereignty is the rights of farmers to save, use, exchange, and sell farm-raised seed, and having that be valued over plant breeders and agrochemical firms' intellectual property rights. And when I talked to native seed keepers and asked, how do you define seed sovereignty? This is Clayton Bracope, who founded the Traditional Native American Farmers Association. And he described it as protecting our living relatives so they can't be molested, contaminated, or imprisoned. And so what I mean by molested is, if somebody tinkers with your relative on the genetic level, he sees that as those seeds being molested. And contaminated, if somebody's GMO corn pollen blows into your field and mingles on your corn, then that seed is now contaminated. And he said by imprisoned, if somebody patents your seeds or the characteristics of your seeds, that impacts how you're able to visit with, exchange those seeds. So he describes it as the inherent right to save seed and pass it on to future generations. And then Rowan White described food sovereignty as the ability to define our relationship to that seed based upon our own values and not the values of anyone else aside of our community. So there are different seed banks in some communities that have been set up as a way of helping to protect and steward and hold those seeds. Tesuque Pueblo in New Mexico has an amazing cob building that's made with straw bales and tires and adobe, and has this wonderful subterranean seed bank as part of it that keeps the seeds at a very consistent temperature, and people in the community can know that they have access to seeds right close by. Similarly, this is at Chijak, the Gun Lake Potawatomi. They have a similar shelf and seed bank there. So again, the idea is, how do you store the seeds locally in the community and not have to be going to these larger seed banks? The Indigenous Seed Keepers Network is a organization that is through the Native American Food Sovereignty Alliance, and is there to help support communities who are interested in learning more about saving seed, revitalizing heirloom seed. Rowan and Clayton have done a lot of workshops along with Shiloh Maples, who directed it for a while. And you can see Zach Page here is giving a hand pollination workshop. So the idea that people who might be very good at gardening don't necessarily have the skills of seed saving. And so this is a way of teaching people how to grow specifically for seed, how to make sure that the seeds aren't, crossing with each other unless you want to, and providing opportunity for seeds exchange. So the seed rematriation movement, so this is a term that I've mentioned a few times, and you've probably heard of the term repatriation, which is, especially through the Native American Grave Protection and Repatriation Act, which is really kind of the returning of something home that should never have been taken. It's kind of this one-way arrow. So prisoners of war are repatriated to their home country. Ancestral remains or sacred objects are repatriated to their tribal nations. And so the term rematriation was developed as a way of acknowledging the women seed keepers, which have been integral to this movement since time immemorial. And is seen as a much more circular process. So the connecting of Indigenous people and seeds, the connection of seeds back to the motherland for which they were developed, and the connection of Indigenous peoples and the land. So I won't get into all of these projects. People should feel free later to ask if you are interested in any in particular. But there have been a number of projects to bring home seeds that are in different institutions or are in different seed banks back to their original communities. So I mentioned the Seed Savers Exchange is working with a number of communities to send seeds home. The Science Museum of Minnesota had a collection that a dentist/anthropologist, Wesley Hiller, back in the 30s and 40s, because guys had all the jobs back then apparently, but he collected seeds from Native communities and then donated this collection when he passed. His family donated to the museum. And so they worked to kind of go back to some of these old seeds and grow them out, see which ones would sprout and get back to the communities they were originally collected from. And we've been working on a similar project with the Field Museum that, the anthropology collections has a number of seeds that were collected as kind of symbols of Native agriculture that was seen as disappearing. But now it's like, how do we reconnect those communities with those seeds? There's also been efforts to reconnect people in land. So the Hudson Valley Farm Hub has teamed up with people from Akwesasne and other Haudenosaunee farmers to grow heirloom seeds on farmland that was once Haudenosaunee farmland. And now most people live a lot farther north. And so this patch of land has been dedicated to growing out heirloom seeds that are then sent back to their communities. So that we have an article coming out hopefully very soon in the Tribal College and University Research Journal, because you can get these seeds back from different museums and institutions and historical societies, but sometimes they're quite old and they have not been stewarded as one might in a seed bank. And so I had some students when I taught at Brown University that we worked with, along with Frank Kutka, who is a corn grower who currently works at the College of Menominee Nation, and Rowan White, a seed keeper. And we worked to talk to different scientists about, okay, if you had really old seeds, what would you do to try to grow them out? And then set up this paper to kind of give people an idea of the range of options from, normal planting, different seed treatments, seed soaks and priming, up through kind of very scientific and some might be a little uncomfortable, kind of extracting tissue from the embryo and culturing it and trying to get a full plant that way. So again, you can grow out all these seeds, you can have all these different garden projects, but how do you get people excited about eating it? And this is where many native chefs have dedicated their life's work, is to educating people through food and getting people excited about native history and culture through preparing these foods. So when I talked to many of these different native chefs and asked them, what was some of their motivation getting into this work, people are proud of their cultures and communities and want to preserve foodways and techniques. You can see Arlie in that top picture there, cooking with an old pot, a traditional Haudenosaunee pot over the fire. And he was like, I wanted to take my cooking way back to, not to get out of that kind of shiny steel kitchen and be thinking about, what are the techniques that we want to preserve and pass on. People are excited about encouraging and inspiring their community to eat this healthy food, to work on some of these metabolic disorders that come from eating the standard American diet, through getting excited about traditional food again. And also just that there's a lack of representation. How many native food restaurants have any of you been to around the country? There's not very many relative to the number of other quote unquote ethnic food restaurants. And so people really wanting to represent their cuisine, especially some of these chefs who have been to culinary school and their instructors didn't have a sense that there was such thing as a native cuisine. So there are a lot of debates around defining and creating traditional food. How do you decide what's traditional? Is it just pre-contact? Is it foods that have been adopted since then and have become important to community members? And there's a lot of discussion around the importance of mentorship. So again, there aren't currently native culinary schools where you can go and get an education in this. So people come together at a lot of these different food summits to learn from each other. And the Native American Food Sovereignty Alliance also has a native culinary program to try to partner up and coming chefs with more experienced chefs who've been doing this for a while. And then in the background there, you can see Sean Sherman has been working on establishing the Indigenous Food Lab, bringing together people who are interested in learning different native culinary techniques. So it's kind of the closest thing to a native culinary school right now. And he's working on establishing these labs in different cities around the country that are close to native communities where people are interested in this work. And especially, women chefs talked about the importance of having mentors, people like Loretta Barrett Oden, who's a Potawatomi chef who's currently working on a cookbook. So look for that coming out of University of Oklahoma Press. But people who had to kind of scrap their way up through these kitchens now working to support other Native women chefs who want to take on this work. And a real focus on supporting Native food producers. So a lot of these different programs or restaurants are really focused on, how do you connect with Native producers and include that food, especially, and highlight that food at these different dinners. So gastro-diplomacy, food studies scholars talk about this as the art of winning hearts and minds through stomachs. How do you educate people about a quote unquote foreign culture through cuisine in a non-threatening way? So how do you use food to enhance cultural understanding and cultural visibility? So this is Quentin Glabus, who works with the I Collective, which is a collective of Indigenous chefs that have hosted a number of different meals, including a big series of meals in New York City a few years ago around Thanksgiving, in which they hosted what they called uncomfortable conversations. So how do you talk about racism in the food system? How do you bring people together for those kinds of conversations? And so they hosted these meals in which they had all of these different interesting native foods. And then as they presented each course, talked about the history and current political situation. So when they served, a beautiful tepary bean dish from the Tohono O'odham Nation on the US-Arizona border, they took the opportunity to talk about, what that border wall going through meant for this community being cut in half. And then other people kind of use these kinds of educational meals as a way of feeding allies. So if you've ever been to a Cafe Ohlone meal and had their amazing food, you get a lot of history as part of that. And often at the end of the meal, Vincent will say, okay, now that you've eaten this food, you're obligated to take this information going forward. And when you hear people saying incorrect things, when you hear people talking about Ohlone people in the past sense, you say, no, I met them. They're nice. They have great food. And so thinking about, how do you bring people in with food and provide that information, and then help people to use that going forward to advocate for your community. So the iCollective, if you go to their website, they currently have a series of cookbooks for sale that are kind of like virtual cookbooks. So I encourage you to go check it out, that have beautiful pictures and recipes and a lot of kind of political history in there as well. And then if you are in the Bay Area, I highly encourage you to go visit with Crystal. Crystal Wapapa is a Kickapoo chef who grew up in Oakland and has spent a lot of time traveling back and forth between Oakland and her relatives in Oklahoma and her relatives up in Northern California. And so has beautiful food in a beautiful restaurant. As you can see, it's got really nice murals, and she is located right outside the Fruitvale BART station. So I highly encourage you to go pay her a visit. It's really nice food. And then Cafe Ohlone used to be set up behind the University Press bookstore until that was closed by the pandemic. But we're working now on getting a space set up outside the Hearst Museum on the campus of UC Berkeley, where they're hoping to open this late spring and bring back some of this beautiful California native food that people really enjoyed getting to share in. And these are the famous acorn flour brownies that Vincent would say, okay, we're going to bring you dessert, but know that going forward, you have to be responsible about sharing this information that we've shared with you. So another issue is around how do you keep the environment clean enough to support the food that people need, the traditional foods that people need to connect with as part of the food sovereignty movement. So I have a chapter in the book that I'm working on right now called You Can't Drink Oil, Water Protectors, Wendigo Slayers, and the Fight for Environmental Justice and Food Sovereignty. Because again, you can't have food sovereignty if your environment is contaminated by a leaking pipeline, or in some cases by mines that people have been trying to put in the upper Midwest, in an area that is covered in lakes and marshes and important food like wild rice. So thinking about the infrastructural violence of where pipelines are sited, and often how the concerns of Native communities are not taken into consideration in deciding where to put a pipeline or where to put a mine. So the Honor the Earth, Love Water, Not Oil tour is part of working against the Sandpiper pipeline in 2014. So this was a series of horseback rides that worked to try to make this landscape more visible to people, because often, the way that the pipeline companies create maps, it's like, oh, well, it's just way up north here. There's nothing up there. Well, except Native people and a lot of important food. And so then similar activism took place recently around Line 3, which is another series of pipelines going in across the upper Midwest. And then in Nebraska, so this is territory where the Ponca people were minding their own business until being rounded up by US soldiers in the 1870s and being forcibly relocated down to Oklahoma. And as part of that, lost a lot of traditional corn varieties because people did not have time to even, it was May in 1877 when the Ponca relocated, didn't have the chance to harvest the corn that had already been planted or pack up corn to take with them. This is Amos Hinton here. And when he was the director of their agriculture program, worked to track down some of these varieties. He read in historical sources about all the different kinds of corn that people had historically, and worked to reconnect with those corns and get some of those back. And then starting in the spring of 2014, on land in Nebraska that was owned by the Tanderup family, where the Ponca Trail of Tears had started. Farmers from that area came together with Ponca people to plant this corn in this field in the path of where the Keystone Pipeline was slated to come through. And then a few years ago, the Tanderup family deeded this cornfield back to the two different Ponca nations. And so people have been resisting this pipeline. And planting these heirloom seeds was part of that resistance. So just kind of in heading toward conclusion, Indigenous food sovereignty has really become a growing international movement, and people from the northern Native communities working to connect with communities in the South. So the photos on the right are from the International Indigenous Corn Conference that was held in Vicente Guerrero in Tlaxcala, Mexico, a few years back, that was hosted by the International Indian Treaty Council. And on this panel here, which is one of many, youth from northern tribes connecting with youth from Mexico and Guatemala in talking about some of the challenges and the efforts to preserve heirloom corn varieties and get people to keep growing these particular varieties of heirloom seeds. And then on the left was from the Uchbenka Corn Conference in Belize, which again, Clayton Bracape, who founded the Traditional Native American Farmers Association, brought a group of farmers from northern tribes down to meet with Mayan farmers. And there was a lot of discussion again around how do you keep youth and people excited about growing heirloom seeds in particular, and protect these kinds of varieties. So there's been increasing efforts to connect people across this border in thinking about preserving heirloom seeds. And then, of course, COVID hit and really impacted a lot of these different projects. So I have a couple of things here people are interested in reading. There's a blog post up on the Garden Warriors Good Seeds blog about how COVID impacted different feeding programs, like the food distribution program on Indian reservations, how all of a sudden everybody wanted to plant a garden when the grocery store shelves went empty. What that meant for seed supply for regular farmers and gardeners. And so we have another paper coming out soon that we worked on in collaboration with the Intertribal Ag Council, in which they sent out surveys to a whole bunch of different food producers. There's about 400 people replied who were food producers or tribal leaders or tribal grocers. And so looking at what farmers and ranchers and grocers, the impact that COVID had on them and their suggestions for, how do you improve things going forward? And so the general consensus was, well, this isn't anything new. It just really highlighted a lot of the challenges that Native people were already facing around food. And so how do we take that information and be prepared for next time and develop better programs going forward? And a lot of it was really around localizing the food system, localizing meat slaughter, meat packing, not having food have to travel, as traveling and supply chains have gotten quite complicated. So just in kind of wrapping up, thinking about how heritage seeds are an integral part of agriculture. This is why we call it that, right? And the health and resilience of Native communities and culture. The importance of reconnecting some of these heirloom seeds back to communities, or rematriation to seed sovereignty efforts, and the way that these are part of mending, creating, and restoring relationships. So there's been different bits and stories throughout that you've seen here where non-Native scientists or farmers or landholders have collaborated with Indigenous communities to help serve some of these needs around reconnecting to the land, the environment, and seeds. So how do you build those respectful relationships? And thinking about how food justice requires environmental justice. You have to protect the integrity and cleanliness of the land if people are going to be able to feed themselves. So with that, I will stop sharing and wrap up. I think we have some time now for questions.
So we can take, I think we've got about 8 minutes or so, not a whole lot of time. We can take a few questions for Elizabeth if you want to put them into the chat. We can start reading them out to her and take a few. So go ahead if you have anything for Elizabeth.
Oh my goodness.
So what is a question what is a question you wish you were asked more, from Cassidy?
Oh, that's a hard one. I don't know. I don't have a good answer. I was not prepared for that. Usually people have very specific questions about space and seed.
Liz Carlisle wants to know any recommendations you have around policy.
Around policy, I mean, there are, good folks in the Native American Farm Bill Coalition, some folks in Intertribal Ag Council who have really been pushing for provisions in the Farm Bill to provide more leeway for Native communities to decide how these funds get spent a lot of times. So, talk about the blog post, Joe Van Alst, who you saw in the picture there kind of pouring the corn, worked for the food distribution program at the same time that he also worked with the local farm. And so they were having trouble sourcing food for one area and trouble finding markets for the farm in the other area. And we're having a hard time being able to combine those. So really, any policy that can support local choice for communities to be able to support local producers, policies that make it easier to localize food systems and, set up, local meat processing and distribution, I think is really important. And allowing communities, so in some spaces, people have been trying to set up opportunities to, create legislation to protect native seed and to allow communities to set up buffer zones to keep GMO pollen out. And because industry owns everything, that a lot of times people have introduced preemption bills first to try to make it so towns and municipalities can't pass GMO exclusion laws. So policy to, again, local control, to allow local communities to decide, what they want to be grown there, what kinds of food they want to be promoted there are important.
Great, thank you. Another question is, what promising or hopeful research directions are you currently pursuing?
I mean, I think part of what's promising and hopeful is just the increased interest in native foods, promoting native plants and native seeds, that there have been more and more people getting interested and getting involved, starting their own farmers and farmer co-ops. There's a great group out of Wisconsin that is the Oneida Corn Growers Cooperative, Ohalagu, where families came together and developed a corn cooperative and got access to land and started growing a lot of this really great corn. And now their community has access to a lot more food in that way. So I think as people are starting to come together and think outside of the box in that way, that I find that really kind of interesting and hopeful and promising.
So have you encountered apprehension or hesitation to share this Indigenous knowledge, as Native knowledge has been abused by outsiders before?
Yeah, I mean, I haven't dug into or shared anything that people weren't interested in sharing. So a lot of it was specific to, how do you develop a group like this? How do you get people excited about these kinds of foods? So I haven't dug into people's specific, ceremonies around these seeds or, any information that people didn't want to share willingly and excitedly.
Thank you. What about bringing seeds in from other countries, such as Guatemala? Is that possible?
If you hide them in your socks and then stick them in your shoes, I don't know what it's like to do. How much? Is this being recorded? Not sure.
It is.
Not sure. But if you put them in dirty socks and stuff them in your shoes.
Okay, thank you. Do you have any take on tribal community gardens?
Yeah, I mean, I think community gardens are great. They've worked great in some areas and less well in others. So it really, I think, you shouldn't just say, okay, this worked well in one area, let's automatically start one everywhere and assume the same model works the same everywhere. When I was out visiting in Pine Ridge, they said people are too spread out here. The idea of a community garden, of getting people to get themselves to one space, doesn't work. So instead they help people to set up gardens in their backyards, or worked with families to kind of come together. And in other spaces, community gardens have worked really well. If people live close enough together to come to those spaces. Sometimes the issue is around labor. If you're doing one big community project, how do you get everybody to contribute enough labor? And in the case of the corn growers cooperative, they kind of had numbered rows. They're like, okay, your family has rows 1 through 3. You're in charge of keeping those weeded. So at the end of the season, even though they divided up all of the product equally, people were expected to still, kind of have tended to those rows. So, in some places, people have been farming and gardening for thousands of years, and it's considered an important part of the culture. And for other communities, it's a newer kind of process. So in the Northwest, when I was in Washington State, visiting with the Nisqually tribe, they're like, well, we're not traditionally farmers and gardeners, but having the garden project there, they used it as a voc rehab opportunity. So people who were coming out of prison, coming out of drug rehabilitation, alcohol rehabilitation programs, had the opportunity to build up their resume by working in this community-owned garden and tribally owned farm and produce vegetables. And it provided a really healthy space for them to do that. So I think gardens can be really great. It's just especially important to find out what people in that particular community are interested in.
Thank you. So I think that about wraps up our time for Q&A, and we really appreciate you having you here with us, Elizabeth. It's been an honor to hear from you. Wish you well. And we're going to invite Greg Castro back on to send us off.
Thank you, Andy. I didn't coordinate with Elizabeth before her talk, but some of the things I talked about in my opening really aligned and resonated with her. And that's because although each and every Indigenous community is unique to themselves with their unique culture and practice and beliefs, there's certainly understandings that we all share because we're all connected to the same earth. And the earth itself is what gives us that understanding, that knowledge, those perspectives. And so we do see those things. And the main thing is she talked about repeatedly in her presentation is relationship. And one of the things that I learned coming up and studying with elders and culture bearers is that really deep understanding. It's more than just a saying to us. Everything's alive. And if it's alive, it has a sense of itself in some way beyond our understanding, and has the capability of developing an interactive relationship like any person. And that's the approach that Native people take is everything's alive, and you form a relationship to it. You go to a new place and you introduce yourself to that place. You ask permission to be there. You ask what it needs, ask what you can bring to it. And in some cases with Native people, we do this every day, even in our own homelands. We come back to it and say, I'm here. What do you need from me today? And then that land, when it appreciates what you've done for it, will give back to you. And that's what a relationship's about. So I encourage everyone to think about relationships in a very intimate way, in a very personal way, not as an abstract, but as a living practice you do every single day, like you do with other family, with friends, with your children, with everything around you. Build that relationship that will strengthen and nurture you the way you strengthen and nurture that relationship. Thanks for having me.
So that is a wrap for this For this keynote, we're going to move on into the next workshops. I believe start at, if I'm not wrong, at 11:15 Pacific. Let me double check. I believe so. Hope so. Hope I'm right there. If not, take a look at the Mighty Networks schedule, and we'll join you, and we'll see you in the next set of workshops. Thank you again, Elizabeth and Greg, and Undersecretary Moffat.